Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're diving straight into the data to shatter a pretty massive myth in the world of sports medicine. We're going to unpack the hard realities of returning to the field after an ACL reconstruction and show you exactly why getting that final clearance from a doctor to play might not actually mean you're cured or even safe from getting hurt again. To really grasp the gravity of this, we have to look at the sheer scale of the problem. We are talking about over 200,000 anterior cruciate ligament, or ACL, injuries happening every single year in the United States alone. That is a staggering number of athletes, from your weekend warriors all the way up to elite high school competitors, who suddenly face this devastating knee trauma that just instantly derails their entire season. So I want you to imagine a young athlete going through this whole ordeal. They endure the initial heartbreak, they go through the invasive reconstruction surgery, and then they face a grueling, exhausting year of physical rehab. Finally, the calendar turns, the doctor gives them the thumbs up, and they get clearance to return to the game they love. But here is the multi-million-dollar question. Are they actually safe? Is the danger literally over just because a medical professional said they can put the uniform back on? Section: The Realities of Returning to Sport. To answer that, we're going to look at a really pivotal study led by Mark Paterno and his team at Cincinnati Children's Hospital. They decided to rigorously track what happens to young athletes right after that highly anticipated return to sport. And right off the bat, the researchers did something incredibly smart. Instead of just counting the months that passed after surgery, they measured athlete exposures, or AEs. An athlete exposure is simply one participation in a game or practice session in a pivoting or cutting sport. This is absolutely crucial because it measures the actual time an athlete spends physically exposed to the risk of playing, rather than just, how many days they've been sitting on the couch since surgery. The study zeroed in on 78 young, highly active patients. The average age was around 17 years old, so prime high school athlete age. And these kids weren't returning to light jogging, right? They were returning to high-risk, pivoting sports like soccer and basketball, sports that demand sudden stops, jumps, and incredibly sharp changes in direction. The researchers then compared these 78 athletes to a control group of healthy peers playing those exact same sports. Section: The Hidden Re-injury Risk. Now brace yourselves because the data reveals a twist that completely reshapes how we view recovery. They tracked both groups for 24 months after they returned to sport. In the healthy control group, 8.5% suffered an initial ACL injury. But then look at the ACL Reconstruction, or ACLR group. 29.5% suffered a second ACL injury. Nearly 1 in 3 reconstructed athletes tore an ACL within 2 years of returning. Let that sink in for a second. You do everything right, you finish all your rehab, and you still have a nearly 30% chance of going down again. And honestly, it gets even more dramatic when you adjust that data for actual playing time, using those athlete exposures we just talked about. The group recovering from an ACL injury faced a nearly 6-fold greater risk of getting hurt again compared to their healthy peers. Once they step back onto that field, their vulnerability is essentially multiplied by 6. Section: Who is most vulnerable? So who is actually bearing the brunt of these devastating second injuries? Well, the demographic reality is deeply concerning. Young female athletes are at an exceptional risk. The study found that a young female who has had a previous ACL reconstruction has an injury rate nearly 5 times higher than a girl who has never had an ACL tear. And this brings us to a huge misconception buster. When we hear about a second ACL injury, we naturally just assume the surgical graft failed, right? We think the repaired knee just gave out. Actually, scratch that. Looking at the breakdown, only 9% sustained an ipsilateral injury, which means a re-tear of that same knee. But a massive 20.5% suffered a contralateral injury. That means the reconstructed knee isn't even the primary danger zone. It's actually the good, supposedly uninjured opposite knee that fails the most often. Building on that, there's a really concerning trend when we split the data by sex. Young female athletes had more than double the proportion of these opposite knee injuries compared to males. 23.7% for females versus just 10.5% for males. So why does this happen? Well, the researchers suggest it's highly likely due to compensatory patterns. Think about it. When you return to a sport, maybe you subconsciously don't trust that repaired knee entirely. Or maybe your rehab just didn't address some underlying biomechanical flaws, so you end up unknowingly putting a tremendous amount of stress on your good leg. And eventually, that good leg just snaps under the pressure. Section: The Post-Recovery Danger Zone. Okay, we know who is getting hurt, and we know which knee is failing. But exactly when are these injuries striking? When we map out injury-free survival over time on a survival curve, the healthy control group stays mostly stable up at the top. But for our recovered ACL group, there is a dramatic, steep drop-off. And it doesn't just happen gradually over 2 years. Nope, the cliff edge is right at the very beginning of an athlete's return to the field. Let's translate that steep drop into reality. Of the athletes who suffered a second injury, 30.4% happened in under 20 athlete exposures. And over half of them, 52.2%, happened in under 72 athlete exposures. For a competitive, in-season high school athlete, 72 exposures is practically nothing. That could be just 12 short weeks of normal practices and games. Think about that. They spend a whole year recovering, and within the first 3 months of playing, over half of all the re-injuries have already happened. Section: Rethinking Return to Sport. This brings us to a really critical junction. We absolutely have to question the standard medical procedures that are leading to this massive vulnerability gap. Now, you might assume the kids who got re-injured just rushed back to the field too soon, right? Wrong. The time spent resting before returning to sport was virtually identical. Athletes who suffered a second injury waited an average of 8.3 months. Athletes who stayed healthy waited an average of 8.2 months. This proves definitively that time alone is a terrible metric for readiness. A calendar simply cannot tell you if a knee is ready to withstand the cutting and pivoting of a chaotic basketball game. Which brings us to the author's ultimate conclusion. I'll quote the researchers directly here. The need to re-evaluate current criteria to release athletes to RTS after ACLR should be considered by the sports medicine community. They hit the nail on the head. What they're advocating for is that we desperately need clinical criteria based on actual biomechanics, neuromuscular stability, and movement symmetry. We have to physically test how an athlete lands, how they jump, and how they balance, rather than just circling an arbitrary date on a calendar and declaring them cleared. So I'm going to leave you with this final thought to take away from this explainer. Is time alone enough, or do we desperately need a completely new standard for recovery? For the parents, the athletes, and the coaches tuning in, this data has to be a wake-up call. We have to completely rethink what it truly means to be cleared to play. Because right now, the gap between being medically cleared and being physically safe is leaving tens of thousands of young athletes exposed on the field every year. Demand better testing, focus heavily on both legs during rehab, and remember that when the calendar says you're ready, your body might still need time. Thank you so much for joining me, and keep questioning the standards.